Once we have the field schema created, generating the proper user interface is relatively straightforward. Your requirements could certainly add some complexity to this, but at its core, the process is pretty simple. Iterate through the fields you've defined and load a component for each. We do that with an ng4 used to create instances of our field component. Inside that field component, load the appropriate template based on the type of field to be rendered. We use a dynamic ng template outlet instead of a big ng switch. And last, set properties on the field's HTML element by binding to properties from the field schema item. There's a little bit more to it than just this, but for a basic functional form, not much. Let's go take a look. Looking at how we generate our dynamic form, we start in our parent component, the widget component. It declares an instance of our dynamic form using the component attribute selector DynForm. It passes in our fields collection, values observable, which we'll take a look at in the next demo when we're talking about data operations, and then also a handler for the submit event. Finally, it sets up two divs with some content, preform and postform, and you'll see in just a few seconds we're going to get that into the proper place on the form using content projection. The class for this, what we're going to look at now, is the fact that our form submit, the show event, the focus, and the blur events are all handled in the parent widget as opposed to handled in the form or in the fields, because presumably the form code is going to be somewhat generic. It's going to be used across multiple instances, multiple forms, whereas the parent container is what's going to have all the logic specific to a particular use of the form. So we want to have all of the logic in the parent container. The dynamic form component, as I said, it's set up with a component attribute selector, so we have the ability to put it just on a div, like we did. So there's DynForm. We have a couple of inputs to get the values in. We saw those when we declared this in the widget component. We're going to dig into the on-init a little deeper when we're talking about data operations, but I want to show you just line 27 where we're setting up our form group. So that's down the bottom here. We just take the fields collection, which is an array of field-based objects. We create an object that has the information for each one and the validators set up. We'll look at the validators in a little more detail a little bit later. And then we just set up our form group based on that object. So we now have all of the different fields set up inside this form group. The HTML for this, we're going to set up our asynchronous loader. So until the data is actually resolved by that observable, we're going to show that loader. We saw that when we looked at the form. Once the data is resolved, once that observable starts returning data, then we're going to show our form itself. And you can see we're using the content projection to get the preform and the postform in place using the ng content. We set up our submit. We'll take a look at that when we get into the code, our form group. And then we have a div that's using an ng4 to iterate through the fields collection. We have a custom track by, and then we create one of two different types of fields, either one that has the hint functionality or one that doesn't, depending on whether or not we have something wired up to that hint. Below that, we just have our buttons, pretty standard form stuff there. Going down one step deeper, we can take a look at our field. So the field itself is set up as a separate component. We're going to get multiple instances of this created by the ng4. It's going to show the field label, and depending on whether or not the field that this field component is rendering is required, it's going to set that required class using the ng class attribute. We then set up our form field, and we're going to use the ng container and ng template outlet with a dynamic get template to determine which template we're going to pull. We set up two spans for either the hint icon or the error icon, and they're going to show whether or not, depending on whether or not we have a hint to show for a particular field, and whether or not there's an error in the validation for that field. So we'll see those in a little more detail when we get into the TypeScript file for our field in just a moment. The rest of this file is going to be the different templates for our field types. And this is what's going to be returned by the getTemplate function call we have on the ngTemplate outlet. So we have a simple text field. We have a text field that's set up to be unique, and we'll take a look at the unique directive in just a moment when we talk about validation. We have a text area that's going to be rendering off to the right-hand side. As we saw in the demo, it actually renders out the sanitized markup that was put into the text area. Checkbox, radio button, drop-down, and number. Now, if you wanted to extend this with additional field types, you would just add additional templates here. Last, we'll take a look at the field component class file. You can see we have an input for the field itself, for the form. We have an output that's going to control whether or not we display a hint, and the action that gets called when a user clicks on that hint icon. And then we're using viewChild to go and get template refs to each of those different templates that we just saw in the HTML. Inside the constructor, we just pass in renderer2 and the DOM sanitizer. We're going to make use of those to manipulate our UI and then sanitize the content coming out of that text area. In ngOnInit, we set up the showHintLink Boolean variable to be either true or false, depending on whether or not anything is listening on that hint observable. So only one of our fields has a hint handler set up. So that's the only one that's going to get that little hint icon. And then we go and grab the form control coming out of the form that represents this particular field. So how is this field shown in the UI? What form control is doing that? After viewInit, we go and set up our native element. We're going to use that for showing the hint and validation icons and error messages. And we register our listeners for any operations. In this case, we're just using focus and blur. Here's our getTemplate that's called by the ngTemplate outlet. And this is what's going to control which of those HTML templates is used for this particular field rendering. We use that display as, which is our enumeration. We check to see whether or not the field is set up to be unique, and this is one of our custom validation pieces that we'll see when we get into the validation section of the module. But if the field is specified to be unique, that is, if there's something registered or something set on the property checkUniqueFunc, then we're going to go grab the unique version of the template. Otherwise, we're just going to grab the regular template version. And that's what gets returned and therefore rendered into the UI inside this ng container. Showing the hint details, this is what gets clicked on when you click on the hint icon. It's just going to emit to the registered hint handler. And then we come down here and we're doing some renderer2 work for showing error messages or hint messages. And they ultimately just call this showMessage, which creates a span, adds some text to it, and then appends it onto the DOM. Hiding the message just takes it out. We'll take a look at the validation error messages more when we get into the validation section. And then registering our listeners. In this case, we're checking to see what events we want to listen for. So if the field has a focus handler defined, we're going to register a listener for the focus event. If it has a blur handler defined, we're going to add a listener for the blur event. And you could extend this by registering any other handlers that you wanted inside here, following this same model. Each of those calls process event and passes in the event that was handled. So process event is just a switch that says, well, which one of these do I need to call? Real quick, we'll take a look at the key down here, and it's important to read that important comment that I have at the top. This isn't a perfect implementation of parsing out dangerous content, but it's a start. But I wanted to have something in the demo that made use of the DOM sanitizer. So here we just go through and strip out some of the HTML and then ultimately call the bypass security trust HTML and render that value off to the right-hand side of our field 2 of our text area. So that is everything that's involved in getting from the field metadata to the field being rendered inside the UI. And now that we've done that, the last couple things we need to do are just our data operations to actually display the data, validate, and then save the data back to ultimately the server when the user clicks the submit button. We'll take a look at those next.